So thank you for joining us for a conversation about the future of aging, and thank you, Milken Institute, for not only organizing this panel, but for all the work that's being done in this critically important area. 1 in 3 Americans is now 50 or over, and by 2030, 1 in 5 will be 65 plus. So as we look at what is a growing population, not just in the United States, but around the world, there are obviously a series of interesting issues and challenges and opportunities to think about. Younger generations will be increasingly involved in their parents' care. Businesses will see new opportunities to meet the needs of this new market. And our communities and our services and infrastructure have to evolve to reflect the changes. I'd like to think that I was chosen for this panel because I'm part of this growing group, but I also think I'm a proxy for some of you in the audience. I do not spend my time during the day thinking about aging, but increasingly I am. We started a few years ago through our station in Minneapolis, St. Paul, TPT, a project called Next Avenue, which is really focused on Americans 50 plus. And it was actually through the work of our colleagues there that I really began to think about how we as a public service media organization can focus more and more of our effort on those over 50 plus, a segment, by the way, that is underserved in the rest of the media landscape. They put together a group and recognized this past year 50 extraordinary leaders who they refer to as influencers in aging, and I'm very pleased that 4 of them are sitting here today to be part of a conversation. So I'd like to quickly introduce Marc Freedman to my right, who is the founder and CEO of Encore.org, Dr. Linda Freed, who is sitting directly next to me, who is currently the Dean of the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Ajahn Pu is the Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Co-Director of Caring Across Generations. And Nora Super, who is the Chief of Program and Services at the National Association of Area Agencies and previously served as the Executive Director of the 2015 White House Conference on Aging. So to get us started, I thought I would actually begin with a question that Paul Irving provoked when we had our pre-call, which is, why aren't you all on the front page of the New York Times every day? Why aren't the issues of aging and longevity, excuse me, I can't even say the word. I knew I should have had that second cup of coffee. Aging and longevity really part of the national discussion. Why is that? Do you want to start, Marc?
Well, I'll start with a slightly contrarian view, which is that I think increasingly they are part of the conversation. There are disparate signs from all directions that I think add up to a turning tide. I felt like maybe we were getting there when there was an article in the New York Times in the, no less the style section a few months ago about the explosion of sales to 30-somethings of gray hair dye. It was titled Prematurely Mature.
Yeah.
And
but that was ironic. That was ironic.
I know, and I'm trying to be ironic as well. But I do think the tide is turning. The problem is that all too often, while the awareness of the demographic changes and even the longevity shift is growing, that our conceptions of what that means remain stuck in the past. It's almost like scenario planning through the rear view mirror. Yeah. You know, we've got the new demographics, but we're still stuck in a picture that is from the 1950s. But I feel like there is a sign of hope, and it's that so many people are not yet waiting for permission to live out this new vision about what's possible. There's already a movement afoot in many parts of society. With our work, we focus on people who are having second acts focused on social change. And we did research a couple years ago that showed 4.5 million people were already doing it. It's not just Jimmy Carter and Bill Gates. 21 million more want to have this kind of encore career. They last about 10 years. That's 25 million people, 10 years apiece, 250 million years of potential human and social capital. And it reminds me of an adage from the science fiction writer William Gibson, who said, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So I think we have material to work with to bring about these changes of people who are living out a vision that is quite encouraging, and I think could shift the headlines from just how this long gray wave of greedy geezers is going to bring about havoc, to one in which is more balanced about what this change could mean.
And just this Sunday, there was that beautiful piece on Alzheimer's. But I think that the issue of how do we really begin to change the narrative? I mean, what do you think it will take? I mean, I think you're right, there's great material, but what is it actually going to take to begin to have more discourse on this subject?
Well, we had a lively conversation in the speaker room about the subject of language and categories. I think we need to come up with a new category for this period of life and of work that's emerging between the middle years and anything representing true old age, and to break free from a lot of contradictory, oxymoronic language for the young old, the working retired. There was a Newsweek article a couple years ago describing men in this period as the walking dead. So I think we need to free ourselves up from this idea that this is just a period of kind of pale imitation youth, and 60 is the new 40, and come up with a category and language that describes what this period is truly like. And I think if we come up with that, with a mental framework and a linguistic framework, that'll help start realizing a richer debate.
What do you think?
So I think on the one hand, we do not have a narrative that recognizes where we are as a society. And hopefully conversations like this and many others will create that. And there are probably a number of reasons why we don't have a narrative. One is that Americans in particular, but most normal human beings don't like to think about getting old. In fact, I think we have an aversion, a deeply human aversion to thinking about being old, which we tie very much to the end of life and dying. And there's a medical condition called a scotoma, which is a stroke to the nerve that goes to the eye. And what happens when you get that stroke is that you actually get a hole in your vision, but you don't know you have that hole in your vision. I sometimes think about the issue of aging as a psychological scotoma, that we really don't realize that we do everything we humanly can to avert our gaze because it's so frightening. But the challenge is that we actually have necessities, but we also have huge opportunities, and we haven't learned how to look at them in order to fill in that hole. So the people who know it, implicitly, in my experience, are the young people. So when I talk to people in their 20s, which I do a lot, and if you ask them, if you say, we've just added 30 years to human life expectancy. It's an unprecedented moment in human history. Humans have never done this before, and we did it through intentional investments in public health and education and poverty alleviation and more recently medical care. Does this affect you? Well, when they think about it, they're all increasingly living their lives with the expectation that they're going to live to 80, 90, or 100. And a lot of them are not in any rush because of that. And if you said, well, if it were 100 years ago in the US and your life expectancy was still 47 at birth, would you be living your life differently? They always say yes. But we haven't learned how to talk about that, and we haven't learned how to plan for it, and we absolutely don't have a language to say, oh my goodness, we just created a new life stage of 30 new years. How do we all get around designing it? Because this could actually be rather fabulous for everybody. But we don't have that language yet.
Nora, was this some of the work that you covered in your work at the Lighthouse?
Yes, when folks were speaking, it just reminded me, I had the opportunity to travel around the country and talk to folks about aging. And there's, just this overwhelming desire for people to have purpose and meaning in their lives at whatever stage of life. I mean, we all want to say that our lives are meaningful. And I think because of the way we have characterized retirement or after work, that people sort of divide their life into, I do something for a job and then I go off and play golf or spend more time with my grandkids. And what we so many people talked about how much they get out of volunteering, trying new careers, thinking about lifelong learning, and it's some of what Linda said about younger people, I think, too, of not going into the workforce now of I'm going to go work at the same place for 30 years, I'll get some good benefits, and then I'll retire, and that's what my life is about. We're all sort of reinventing this. Like, what does this mean? I'll try this for a little while, and then I'll try this, and so I think there was a hunger out there for this type of information but a little bit back to what Linda was saying, I think too often, certainly in Washington and other places, we have sort of a youth-obsessed culture. And even when we talk about solutions, people in the room, I mean, I can remember having conversations with folks from the Treasury Department and the Labor Department about how to encourage people to save more. And these were, people who have been in the field for years who are now in their 60s and 70s, and they always talked about older people as them, not us. And people don't think about it as us, and embracing that we're all aging. One of my favorite quotes is from a friend here in California that said, "We're all aging. Some of us just have more experience than others."
So, as you've traveled around, have you given any thought to how actually we could begin to change the narrative, and perhaps how media might play a role, or how do we, because I think you're absolutely right. I think this becomes very uncomfortable territory because it is very personal, as well as obviously, reflecting our larger issue. How do we begin to pivot the conversation? How do we begin to really wrestle with this as not an end-of-life discussion, but really just another life stage discussion as every stage builds on the next?
Right. I mean, I think, when you mentioned the front page of the New York Times and what we focus on, I actually have a slide 1, that is from a New York Times article that ran a couple weeks ago. You all may have seen the front page of the Post and the New York Times that looked at the longevity of people and the longevity gap that we're having in this country between the rich and the poor. But what I thought was most fascinating about it is there were really sharp differences in places of the country for the low income who actually do better in certain parts of the country. So in San Francisco or New York City, poor people do better than they do in other parts of the country. And most of what this was attributed to once they, took out income and education was healthy behaviors and healthy communities. And what I know from working in Washington for so many years, politics is local. So when we start doing things such as Milken's been doing with rating cities and a whole age-friendly initiative where you start to look at your local communities and how do I compare? And am I going to live longer if I live someplace other than another? And that all goes back to many of these investments that we make in our own communities to healthy living at all ages of life, which has tremendous implications for our government programs, the businesses we invest in, the way we educate people, all of those things that I think is a way that captures the attention more of people that this will really have an impact on my life.
Ajahn, you've spent work focused very much on the caregiver, and I'm interested both in terms of what you're seeing here, but also what you've seen around the world. Earlier, there was also a piece that I heard on NPR maybe 2 weeks ago that really was talking about Japan and the challenges in birth rate, and how in really grappling with caregivers for the older members of the population, looking at all kinds of innovative solutions, including robots, which sounded so bizarre, but as I thought about and listened to the story, clearly is an issue that is, at least it's one innovative idea, maybe not the best, but I'm just curious, as you look at this both here and around the world, has anyone figured this out, this whole challenge of caregiving?
It's a great question. I wanted to just start by saying a couple of things about the narrative piece, and then I'll pivot to that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to skip over you before.
No, that's okay. I mean, because I actually think it's related. We are up against a very deeply held, deep-seated cultural norm around fear of aging. And I think it's going to take a major culture shift in how we relate to it that has to do with media has a huge role to play. But I also think that given that we're here in Los Angeles, popular culture and popular culture storytelling has a huge role to play. And I think we really underestimate its power oftentimes and in setting and transforming norms. And just on that front, I feel like, in the spirit of what Marc said, the seeds are already there in terms of a culture shift in popular culture, where you're starting to see shows like Grace and Frankie. Has anybody seen that show? And then even Aziz Ansari, who's the sort of millennial poster child, had an episode in his series on Netflix, Master of None, called Old People, which everybody thinks is the best episode of the entire season. And so I think we're starting to see the kind of popular culture storytelling that allows us to prefigure a new set of cultural norms. And I want us to actually drive more of that storytelling, because I think the power of story is what allows us to see a different image of ourselves and start to embrace a different image of ourselves. And we saw that so powerfully with the LGBT movement work, right? In terms of what shows like Will and Grace and Glee were able to do for us. So I think that culture can lead to all kinds of breakthroughs. And then on the global front, I do think that part of what we can learn from Japan is a healthcare system and a long-term care system that is universal or much more comprehensive than what we have here, and then a way that they're trying to leverage technology to deal with a major shortage in caregivers. And part of what we have here is a situation where we have millions and millions of caregivers, family caregivers and professional caregivers, who are undervalued, who are not supported, who are completely overstretched and overstressed. And I think that what Japan has done is put some policy and systems frameworks in place to be able to provide some practical support there, but they still need more caregivers. And so we have a different set of problems, but I think we can learn a lot from how they've deployed technology. There's this one piece of technology that they've created called the Caregiving Time Bank, where you can go and cook dinner for your neighbor and log those hours and those services in a time bank, and then cash them in for your mother who lives on the other side of the country for those same services. It engages everyone and leverages technology to create a new kind of system for caregiving. And then the robots piece, I think, is fascinating, because a lot of the talk is about, will robots replace caregivers?
Supplement, correct?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. And I think what we can learn is ways that robotics and technology can really help enhance the caregiving experience and provide new support to caregivers.
So how do we begin to convene these conversations? I mean, how do we get the right people around the table to begin looking at not only naming the problems, but really begin to look at potential solutions?
Well, I think this kind of conversation is a great start, and we need to be having them in more places, and we need to be thinking creatively about who needs to be at the table. Mm-hmm. That this is really longevity in the fact that we have this new opportunity of longer life, right, is something that affects everything about the way that we live, work, and play in this country, and therefore everyone needs to be a part of the solution. So I would love for us to really think about how we democratize the spaces where we have these conversations about what to do.
That's great. That seems like a nice pivot back to you, Marc, because you're obviously the thing that was striking to me when we began some of the work with Next Avenue is also really recognizing that there are various life stages. One tends to lump everything into aging and longevity as if it's one issue, but obviously you're looking at helping people age well long, and longer, and really looking for value and meaning at one stage, and then obviously as one progresses through life, dealing with other challenges. You're obviously focused mostly on that first part. Can you talk a little bit about that work and how we had such an interesting conversation in the green room, which I wish we could replay for all of you, about also managing expectations within the workforce and how we really look at the fact that, and there was a session here on multi-generational workforce, how we really look at companies managing older employees and what does that mean and so forth. And I just wonder what you'd like to comment on that.
Well, I was
Which is
really...
the question you told me not to ask you.
Yes, exactly.
Which of course means I had to ask you.
I appreciate it. And, you know, I'll start...
And then Linda will come behind you and answer
yes,
it.
Yes. I did want to just pick up what Nora, Linda, and Jen were saying, too, about these kind of subtle signs of a shift. And Jen talked about being here in LA and the story down. I mean, I've been doing these panels at Milken for probably 4 or 5 years now, and 4 or 5 years ago, who would have thought that we would be coming off a year in which Hollywood made a movie called The Intern with Robert De Niro playing the intern, and the tagline, which still hangs in front of my neighborhood video store on the poster, "Experience never gets old."
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to say that in a scenario planning exercise, you say that's totally unrealistic,
Yeah.
but these things are starting to happen, and so I think, and similarly, you know, it's not just all these older cultural icons who are continuing to work, but Michael Kinsley just wrote a beautiful book, Old Age: A Beginner's Guide. I may be getting the title wrong. And one of the comments of the review in the New York Times is that, in a way, he's part of this whole wave of writers and journalists who are hitting this period and naturally starting to reflect on it. And so I think we're seeing a lot of this stuff happening already, but along with the cultural change, to actually address your question, I think we just need a lot of social innovation. We innovated spectacularly over the last half century for people not to work, right? For the freedom from work. And we created retirement as we know it. And this hotel was built by Del Webb, who later invented Sun City 5 years later with the phrase the golden years, and this whole idea of leisure as and we invented senior centers and AARP and retirement communities and Medicare. And how do we start inventing around the freedom to work, to continue to contribute in new ways, oftentimes to new ends? And that's happening fitfully and not fast enough to keep up with the population changes. And so I'd love for us to bring into that conversation, we were talking about the entrepreneurs and innovators who are doing great things in many other areas but haven't yet really started to contribute as fully as is needed here.
You had some very specific thoughts about this.
Well, maybe a broader framing. I think it's, I think about these issues globally as well as domestically. One unique U.S. frame, I think, is that the U.S. does better in meeting needs if it sees opportunity, if we see opportunity. And so I think it's very important to start out by saying that we haven't invested adequately in the science, but the science we have suggests that the opportunities of maturity and longevity are breakout, huge. And there are opportunities for older people, assuming we age healthily, to do some of the most meaningful things of our lives. There are opportunities in the workplace to benefit from the assets of older people, but we haven't actually built the roles that really capture those assets. And the assets are large, starting with what Marc said, in terms of the assets of experience. You know, so a life of experience yields a few learnings. And science would say that as people get older, they have the ability to do something that young people really haven't gotten to yet, which is to use accrued knowledge and expertise in combination with your valuation of what matters most. and the ability to respect the subjective learnings of a lifetime and put them together into much more complex and sophisticated analyses than you can arrive at without that. And so as people mature, we, hopefully all of us, have the ability to actually recognize the complexities of the challenges of life, to tolerate that, which is sometimes hard to tolerate, to have the experience to be able to parse it, to figure out what the actionable elements are, and how to, with patience, but a huge sense of urgency on what matters most, because you're not going to be around forever, get it done. Now those are valuable assets in a world of highly complex problems, whether they're in the workplace or they're in society. And I think the opportunity of having as many older adults as we have kids in society, we've never had that before. The opportunity to learn from the evidence that intergenerational work teams are more productive and more successful and more creative than single generational work teams. The evidence is really exploding that there are untold opportunities we never had before. We just have not interrogated, as you're doing today, adequately how to understand them and how to build to make use for them. In my experience, I mean, as I look at what we have, except perhaps for the tech world, most of the jobs in the world were designed when life expectancy was 47. Maybe we do them a little bit differently, but we haven't designed them to harness the experience and assets of the older workforce we have. We recognize when we think about the fact that 50% of the US federal government workforce is in the process of retiring, we recognize that that's a huge loss of human capital and accrued knowledge at one time, and we probably wouldn't want to do that. But we have not had the conversations in the main to think about how we create new opportunities for people who want to stay working to be able to be contributing, maybe in new configurations in the workforce, how we develop new policies to support perhaps the medical care side so employers can afford the increased health care costs that to some degree come along with getting older. So there's a lot of planning, but I believe that Americans will do better if we appreciate the opportunities, and then we can plan for dealing with the necessities better.
What, you know, and again, obviously there are forums like this, but as someone who's also responsible for running an organization and grappling with issues of how I can retain employees that want to work longer, and how we build the kind of organization that takes advantage. How do we start to share those models and what we're learning? Because as you point out, and I hadn't really thought about it until you just said it, that in fact that this is really the first time we're wrestling through these kind of issues because of the numbers of people that want to live purpose-filled lives, and whether that's working full-time or balancing out. One of the things we talked about in the green room is I sit on the board of one of the Smithsonian museums, which is wrestling with a very real challenge because they're government employees of a large number of the curators who are ready to retire, which would have a devastating impact on the organization. But how do you manage that so that people can begin to slowly retire as they choose to, but also stay engaged? And how do you also facilitate that transfer of learning and knowledge is, I think, really fascinating, both in the nonprofit sector, obviously, and the corporate. But how do we start to have those conversations?
So I think Marc said that rightly that we have been engaging in local and small experiments for many years. What we could do is actually learn from them.
That's my question.
But we need to do that rather intentionally, and I think we need to do it at the level that you're speaking at, which is institutionally, not one human being at a time trying to call up a bunch of friends to say, what have you learned? But institutionally, how do we both learn together about the array of opportunity and models, and then how do we learn together to deploy them at the level of institutions, not just individual change in practice. And how do we think about that societally? Because I do believe that our society has huge potential benefits that we could really invest in and harness if we do this at a societal level. And this is the moment.
I would just contrast, just real quick, look at how much time, effort, and money is being invested in human longevity, right? You know, Google and AbbVie have Calico. There's Craig Venter and Peter Diamandis are doing the human longevity organization. There's now $1 million Palo Alto Longevity Prize. If we were investing a fraction in improving the quality of lives, of these longer lives, as we were in extending them, we would be starting to do some of the things that the panelists are talking about.
Paula, can I just mention something? Because the conversation, as you talked about how to spread it, I think one of the learnings we really had with the White House Conference on Aging this time, you know, we had a very small budget. We couldn't do, it used to be we'd bring in 2,500 people into DC and put them all up and people would do that. We couldn't do that. So we used technology. We leveraged technology to have discussions all over the country. So we, you know, on the day of the White House Conference on Aging, there were over 700 watch parties of people that were participating, you know, via a web stream. They had the same discussion questions that we set up to go in and have people talk about certain issues and then send them into the White House for that discussion. And I think that there are, you know, just these great opportunities that technology brings for us to do things. I mean, you know, I'm sure Linda could talk all day about the way the education system is changing and online learning as a potential really, you know, disrupting the way that people are being educated in this country as well. And I think, you know, taking advantage of those to spread the information, to spread the knowledge, to make people think about the different images that we have of older people. You know, as Aijan said, with the images here in Hollywood, but also just what happens in social media when people, you know, will retweet that. I don't know how many of you all saw, but this, you know, 100-year-old woman who wins, you know, the race as a, you know, she's the sprinter, and she took up running when she was 67, and I retweeted that, and everybody was liking it and pushing it because we love those positive images that we can use. And so I think the more that we harness technology in that way to say, well, if she can do it, I can do it.
The work that now at the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, obviously you're looking at government agencies and private programs, and I think that as we're looking at these questions as well as some of the other questions that we began to tee up at the front end of this conversation, how can we really, and perhaps technology is one part of the solution, of being able to get more and more people into the conversation so that we're really beginning to not only learn from the experiences but also bring other stakeholders to the table? Because I think that you know, one of the challenges of this panel is we could have talked about many different sides of both the issues and the opportunities that come out of the question of how do we live better, longer, healthier lives, and how do we support the aging members of our community and ensure that they are a rich part of the community throughout their lifespan. How do you feel as we look at trying to share what we're learning from you know, either the work that Marc has started or what some of the examples that Linda has mentioned? How do we begin to get those stakeholders around the table for the conversation and bring the public into the conversation so that they're part of it?
So, I mean, I'll try to be brief because I could talk about this a long time, but you know, one thing to note is the organization that I work for is based on a 1960s model of the Older Americans Act that gave funds to local area agencies on aging to provide services to people over 60. That model is turned on its head now because we have a budget situation where lawmakers at the federal, local, and, you know, state level have all focused on reducing costs, especially to discretionary programs. That's had an impact on our communities, as we've seen all over, whether, you know, the conversation yesterday about clean water and what happened in Flint, bridge infrastructure, other things there. But I think everybody's trying to reinvent themselves, including the social service agencies. And the healthcare cost is really one big part of the driver, making those connections. And this is a public health concept of the social determinants of health. How much what happens outside of the doctor's office or what happens in the hospital really impacts your health. And so I think we're learning more and more and bringing more people into that conversation. It's not just the social scientists, it's not just the public health people, but it's, folks that really say, well, how can I feel better, live better, want to have a long and healthy life, and by the way, reduce the cost of government expenditures. And so I think we are seeing the conversation growing. I mean, I would say in technology, the Obama administration has always been big fans of Silicon Valley, and that some of that's great, some of it, is a little challenging to always get older people engaged in that, but I would go out there. I went out several times and be swarmed with people with the latest new technology that there was. So there's a huge understanding that this is a huge opportunity, a market opportunity for people. But again, looking at ways that I think that the technology really helps complement what we're doing and allows people to be as independent and healthy as they can be for as long as possible, because that's what people want.
Well, as you look at people's use of digital media and social media, some of the biggest increases are in older Americans, and so I think there is an opportunity there to build upon. But also, we have the opportunity through technology, to bring people together around issues,
Right.
and I think that. That some of the, and I agree, I don't, that there has been more discussion, I think in part because there's so many baby boomers that are really driving the discussion, as we're really demanding the fact that we want to live a different kind of life than the generations before us. But I think that, again, figuring out what those needs are, I mean, what are you seeing as you're looking at the needs of caregiving as we look forward, and how does that really fold into this larger conversation? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I think that the fact that 20% of our population will be over the age of 65 by 2030, and people in my grandmother's demographic of 85 and older are the fastest growing demographic, just says something about a different kind of infrastructure that we need in order to support our extended kind of trajectory of life. And a lot of that has to do with caregiving. A lot of that has to do with just the increase in need that we'll have in order to allow for people to live well longer. And a lot of what that means, 90% of all Americans would prefer to age at home in community, right? Connected to family and friends and community. And I think that don't have the infrastructure in place to really support that. The older model was an institution-based model, and nobody wants that anymore. Nobody wants to be in a nursing home for any number of reasons. And there's been really good work to try to reform how nursing homes operate, but I think the future is about home and community-based solutions and a new infrastructure that supports that, including support for family caregivers. Right now, there are more than 43 million adult age working people who are also on top of their full-time jobs, spending at least 20 hours a week caring for family members, and they don't have financial support to do that. They don't have community or other kinds of supports to do that, or training. So there's a huge amount we can do to support working family members who are caring for their loved ones. And then there's this professional workforce that, because of the huge demand for care, especially at home care workers are the fastest growing occupation in our entire economy. Fastest growing, and anticipated to grow at 5 times the rate of any other workforce in our entire economy for the next decade. And the average median income per year is $15,000. So you're talking about people who are working hard, caring for the people we love, and they can't care for themselves or their families doing this work. So there's a huge opportunity here to transform what have been undervalued jobs into good jobs that can then support this whole infrastructure we'll need for people to have choices, to live in community, connected to their families and friends. And it really is about a kind of 21st century infrastructure to support working families who happen to have people who are more people at the older end of the spectrum.
It's, there hasn't been a lot of, so I'll put you on the spot, there hasn't been a lot of talk during this election about any of these issues, including this one. What do you think it's going to take to get this on a national agenda?
It's a great question. I spend every day of my life thinking about that question. You know, this is an issue which has also, we have a cultural way that we've handled it, which is to very much internalize the challenges as our own personal failures. Our failures that we didn't save enough, that we weren't a good enough daughter, or that we weren't, you know, we didn't have the foresight to plan, that it's our fault that we're somehow in crisis because we're not prepared for the changing needs of our families. And so it's very much seen as this kind of private and personal issue, which feels to me ridiculous if we're all feeling it. Seems like a pretty fundamental design flaw there. And I think we have yet to kind of take the conversation from our homes and our kitchen tables into the national public conversation about what are our policy priorities, what do we need to do as a country to really succeed and make sure everyone does well in the future. And so I think we collectively have a responsibility to raise the saliency of this issue, right, to the level of a national political priority so that our leaders can actually start to talk about a plan in a real way. I mean, that's all we need is a plan. It's pretty straightforward. And I think it'll take kind of a groundswell of lots and lots of us saying, we need a plan.
Do you want to add on to that, Nora?
I think about the election every day too, and you know, one thing when you were speaking, I thought, you know, here we are now with Senator Cruz dropped out yesterday, so all of the people left in the race are in their 60s or 70s. And so this whole idea that, you know, your life is over when you turn 65 and you should just play golf, you know, they're all living emblems of, like, you could be president of the United States. And so, you know, I think it's really funny to think about it in that way. And I think it will grow. And, you know, both Senator Sanders and Hillary Clinton have long track records on aging issues. I think caregiving, as Ajam was saying, is a bipartisan issue. It is something that people are talking about. There's a new caucus on Capitol Hill that's bipartisan on both the House and the Senate side on caregiving. I think people are, it's happening in their own families, so there are policy solutions. And I would say, you know, we have not had a national discussion since you know, back when Boehner and President Obama tried to have the big deal about Social Security and Medicare, but we can't keep avoiding it. You know, the impact on our economies of Social Security and Medicare and what we can do. And some of this is shifting people from institutions to home and community services because it's less expensive, but it's also what people want. But in Social Security, you know, it's people needing to work longer. There are these policies that I think we haven't had a opportunity because of the polarization in Washington. And, you know, as a person who worked most of my career to get the Affordable Care Act, so much energy spent on fighting about Obamacare that, you know, hopefully we can get to another phase where we're looking at some of these bigger, broader challenges as a country and coming up with bipartisan solutions. It'll take, you know, the election time will be crazy, but I think to the extent that those of us, you know, who work in communities and with people can raise up these issues like, look, we need to fix it. I mean, the Flint, Michigan is being one of those issues of, like, this is a government responsibility. And I think as we look at older, vulnerable, frail adults, it's, you know, nobody wants to see people dying in the streets, and once they see what nursing homes are like, they don't want that for their loved ones. So, you know, grappling with these issues needs to become a national priority. We need to demand more of our leaders to talk about it.
Do either of you want to make a comment? I figured you might.
We probably all think about this
Yeah,
every
we all
single
do.
day. You know, this country has a really admirable history, if you talk about Social Security and Medicare, of enacting policy that recognizes that we're all in this together. So we forget that Social Security and Medicare were enacted as family policies to be able to provide support for people in their later years, so that their working age kids didn't go broke doing the right thing by them. These were family policies, and similarly, we're all in this one together on all the rest of this stuff. As Aijen was saying, in terms of family caregivers, how we recognize both the necessities of our changing demographics and the huge opportunity, and build to meet one and to experience the other, is, I think, the imperative of the moment. And in my dreams, the candidates will have a call to action for us to engage not just in a national conversation, but actually to ask every older adult to step up and serve. We need every older adult in this country. We have profound issues. Our kids need every older adult in this country. We now have an older adult for every kid in this country. We could turn around our kids' future, and they are the future older adults. So this would be the moment, and we could do it. We know enough now about how to actually design programs that older adults can serve the future, can be the stewards of the future, but we haven't built the programs at scale to enable us to benefit from what they have to offer. And we know enough now to design health systems that could actually help everybody get to old age healthy. It's time to redesign our public health system and to invest in training the geriatricians and care providers who know what to do. That will lower our healthcare costs largely if we make those investments. This would be the moment to do it. And having a presidential campaign where there would be a call to action and a call for older adults to serve, really to turn around the future of our country, this would be the moment.
And that's your work.
And what work that Linda, I mean, the irony is to pick up on Linda's wonderful call to service there. So when John Gardner was Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and he had the initial idea that Linda and I worked so hard on to create an experience corps, when he was implementing Medicare, he gave a speech and he said, America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as unsolvable problems. And I think that it very much captures what Aijen was talking about, and to echo Linda's point as well earlier about the blind spot, right? So we have all these candidates. They haven't issued the call to action. They don't have a plan. But even more, they haven't even embraced their own age and themselves as examples. But I think that these breathtaking opportunities are sitting right in front of us. And to describe and to pick up on what Linda was saying, I think we have to turn around a tragic error we made 50 years ago, in which we told older people to pretend that they were kids again, to have a second adolescence. And that ran against human nature. I mean, there's now an accumulation of evidence from programs like Experience Corps, from longitudinal studies show that the greatest source of happiness in later life is to invest in younger generations. George Valen at Harvard Medical School found that people are 3 times as likely to be happy in later life if they engage and mentor in this way. And he says biology flows downhill. That's human nature. So shouldn't society flow downhill instead of telling older people to pretend that they're younger people, why not encourage them to embrace their age, to serve the future, to be there for those people who actually are young, to care across generations, in Ijen's wonderful phrase. And so I think that that's the pivot that we need to make right now, because what we're looking at is a solution that's waiting to happen.
But to come back to your optimistic voice from the very beginning of this panel, you're definitely seeing the trends, correct, of more and more people that are really trying to figure this out for their own life and are very interested in helping to create opportunities for others, correct?
Right. I don't think we have to create the interest. We don't have to create human nature. It's all there. What we have to do is meet people halfway to come up with the categories, the social innovations, the policies. I'm struck everybody's talking about Obama taking a gap year, right? That's great. What about a gap year for grown-ups where they serve the next generation or their own generation? So I think that the moment is ripe for the ideas and for the call to action and to really embrace the opportunity in front of us.
We have just a few minutes left. Before I turn to the panel for last comments, I wonder if anyone has any questions. Wait for the mic, because they're typing this and they want to make sure that they capture. There you go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments. One of the things that didn't get addressed as is the issue of people who particularly went through the 2008-2009 economic cycle and their retirement plans that they were counting on, the value substantially dropped. And in the current economic environment, that hasn't been made up. And so where there are many people who thought they would retire and do all of these other things, whether it's being, going back to being children or getting involved in the nonprofit arena and making a difference, are feeling unable to do so because the economics of planning for a much longer life didn't dictate that they were able to do so. I wonder if you'd address some of those issues of the economics of individuals as well as our society with respect to longevity.
So
Who wants to
I'm
take
happy to take, as part of the White House Conference on Aging, we had 4 pillars, and the first one was retirement security. And that was when looking at many of the phenomenon that you describe, home equity had traditionally been a source of stability for older people, and most people lost their home equity in the recession and lost their 401k assets as we've shifted to a system that is much more reliant on individuals and not corporations to fund retirement. I do think, though, that's another area that we really need to look. One of the things we profiled at the White House was the sharing economy, which is a good opportunity for older people. Airbnb spoke and talked about how, older people are their best host because they tend to have homes, they have time, and they need the money. And so, those were great opportunities for them to have folks there. The same with Uber as opportunities for people that, need the income, but need the flexibility also of not having to go and have a job every single day. So I think there, as we were talking earlier, with employers too, as we recognize the human capital that people have too, but also the income that they need, which is a very real issue. And another one that I think why we need to look at Social Security. There are all kinds of solutions. We know what the solutions are, really, but we just need to have our elected leaders look at these issues and change the way we fund Social Security and how we give it to folks to help with the caregiving needs, to help with the longevity needs. It sounds like you might be in the financial industry. One of the striking things I found, and then I'll be quiet, but is that people in the healthcare and long-term care community really don't talk to people in the retirement asset community. And so they speak these different languages, but they're often talking about some of the same solutions. And I think back to the beginning of where people don't like to think of themselves as getting older and not needing it, but people will look at their finances. What do I need to live? I'm not going to die at 70. I'm going to maybe die at 100. And so redesigning some of those financial planning exercises that we have and ways that people can really look to their future in a secure way.
Add one other thing. There's increasing evidence that economically that a lot of the myths that we assume don't have a basis. One of the myths we assume is that if older people have jobs, then young people lose. There is no support for that, but it's a hard lost myth. In fact, when older people are working, there are more jobs and more economic well-being to hire young people. And so the truth seems to be in exactly the different direction from a myth. There are many of these either-or false choices that we have as our default assumptions that seem to drive a lot of our policy thinking, but in fact, when you look at the evidence, it's not supported. So if in fact it actually would be good for the economy for older people to stay in the workplace, then I think this is the right moment. And people need to and want to, not the only solution, we need an array of solutions. Then how do we roll up our sleeves and figure out how to make that possible? There are some probably short-term things that could be looked at by our presidential candidates, like, for example, how could Medicare pick up the costs of medical care for older employees, people over 65 who are Medicare eligible? That particular fix would actually perhaps be welcomed by many employers and would make it more feasible for them to keep an older employee who has a higher income than a younger employee. There are many other things. The other thing is to think about what Aijen was saying in terms of the opportunities opened up for new jobs for people of all ages because we're living longer lives. We have needs that we need a whole new service sector for. We could intelligently design a whole new health system that builds health and provides caring if we valued people properly. So I think if we can open up our minds about this, there are a lot of opportunities to deal with it in a way that's a win-win for everybody.
So I'm going to call on Marc, and then you will have the last word. How's that?
Yeah, just to echo what Linda was saying and pick up on something Aijen said earlier about how all too often we view caregiving dilemmas as individual problems. And I think it's so true for this transition that so many people who need to work longer have to make from what they were doing last to what's next, but they're solving that one at a time and oftentimes at great personal cost. But what happens when tens of millions of people are solving this transition that one at a time? Could we do, you talked about Medicare innovation, why not be able to take a year of Social Security early to make this kind of shift, invest in retooling and education, then work an actuarially adjusted period later? I mean, we're not even having those kinds of conversations, and as a result, people are having to scramble and improvise to do something that's not just an individual imperative, but a social imperative.
Last word.
Ooh, last word. Well, I was just reminded of something that David Hyde Pierce said at the White House Conference on Aging when he opened up the caregiving panel. He said, we must remember that to age is to live, and to care is to be human. And I feel like at the end of the day, what we've been talking about here is just kind of simply, living longer is such a beautiful opportunity to love longer, learn longer, connect longer, teach longer, contribute longer, all of these things, but we actually need to design for it. We need a plan, we need to design, we have to do it thoughtfully in order for us to be able to realize the opportunity of what longevity offers. And I think it has to be a really collective, all hands on deck process of designing. And there's huge opportunity in it. So I think if we could all put on our virtual reality David Hyde Pierce glasses to be like, what if we saw the world again anew through that lens of to age is to live and to care is to be human, and looked at everything through that lens, I think we'd see the world quite differently.
A perfect ending. Thank you very much.